We're going to dive into the quiet, fascinating, and sometimes kind of tricky world of our own wants. And it all really starts with a simple question, one that we ask ourselves in some way every single day. So why do you pick one thing over another? I mean, it seems so simple, right? I just like what I like. But it turns out the story of our preferences, well, it's one of the most revealing stories about who we are.
You know, take ice cream. Some of us will always choose bubblegum over chocolate. And who knows why? Maybe it's your biology. Maybe it's a memory of some perfect summer day. Or maybe it's just the simple fact that you love it. That's a preference, and it adds color to your life. Or think about this one. Choosing a pretty rare Sluie over a classic Labrador. That isn't just about the dog, is it? It's a statement about you. Our preferences, they signal our identity, our history, and sometimes maybe even the things we feel are missing. They are almost never random.
But here's the absolute heart of the matter. Just because a desire feels deeply personal, just because it feels urgent, that doesn't make it trustworthy. In fact, learning to tell the difference between what we want and what's true, that's one of the biggest challenges of being human.
So, how does a simple preference, something that just brings us joy, start to turn into something else? Well, it happens through 3 really quiet, almost invisible shifts.
Okay, the first shift is in degree. This is when your range of what's acceptable just narrows down to a single point. It's the difference between saying, oh, chocolate is my favorite, but vanilla will do, and saying, chocolate, or I'll have nothing at all. Your preference has just become a rigid requirement.
Next up is frequency. This is when you find yourself going back to that thing more and more often. But here's what's so interesting. There's a shift that happens. The time you spend on it quietly grows, while the enjoyment you actually get from it quietly shrinks.
And the final shift is satiation. This is when the off switch for your desire just breaks. You have some, but you're never really satisfied. Neuroscientists have a term for this. They call it the split between liking and wanting. Your wanting goes through the roof, but your actual liking of the thing, it flatlines. So when these 3 shifts happen, when the degree hardens, the frequency speeds up, and satiation fails, a really fundamental relationship gets turned on its head. And you get this new reality. You are no longer in the driver's seat. Now, if you let it go unchecked, this drift has a real cost, but it's a strange one, kind of a paradox. The world doesn't get bigger with more of what you want. It actually gets smaller.
Think about a balanced life, right? You've got multiple sources of satisfaction and meaning. You've got your work, your friends, different hobbies, a bunch of different experiences. Your world is wide and it's colorful. But as that one desire starts to take over, it doesn't just add something to your life, it crowds everything else out. Your whole world shrinks. Suddenly, there are fewer acceptable foods, fewer people you can really connect with, fewer places you can even go. And here is the really strange math of it all. As the desire grows, you want it more intensely than ever before, but you enjoy it less and less. You get the thing you thought you wanted, and instead of joy, all you feel is relief. And then, almost immediately, the next hunger starts to form.
So when these patterns get really hard and stuck, we give them names. But it's helpful to think of them not as character flaws, but as the predictable outcomes of a system that has just lost its flexibility.
Addiction, that's when a preference becomes a prison. Hoarding creates a kind of museum of frozen desires. Obsession is when the thought of the thing just comes back, uninvited, again and again and again. Compulsion is when you act without even wanting to, just to quiet the anxiety. And idealization, that demand for perfection, well, that just guarantees you will never, ever be satisfied.
So the crucial point here is this. These are not moral failures. They are what happens when the natural gravity of desire goes unopposed for too long. It's just a system that's lost its balance.
So what's the way back? The good news is, it doesn't require some dramatic, heroic effort. The path back to balance is paved with small, quiet, and repeated acts of resistance. So here's a little toolkit. If the desire has become really rigid, practice micro-flexibility. Go ahead and intentionally choose the second best option and just notice that you survive. If it's compulsive, try a scheduled pause, maybe one day without it. Not to prove you can, but to feel what it was covering up. And if a desire feels insatiable, practice savoring. Just a 30-second pause to let a single experience actually land.
Now, these little practices can lead you to an even deeper question. When that feeling of just bottomless wanting won't stop, it's worth pausing and asking yourself, what is it that I actually truly need right now?
Because the answer is almost never more of the thing you're craving. It's usually something much quieter, much more fundamental. It's the need for rest. It's the need for genuine human connection. Or it's the need for a sense of meaning in your day.
Look, the point of all this is not to become some person with no desires. A life without preferences would be totally colorless. The goal is simply to get back a little bit of flexibility, to hold our wants lightly enough that we can choose to set them aside when we really need to.
And that leaves us with one final question to think about. When we finally manage to put the thing down, even just for a moment, and we feel what comes up in its absence, what do we discover was hiding underneath it all along?
Why do you prefer, say, bubblegum ice cream over chocolate? Or, why might you choose a lean, ancient, slowy dog from the Sahara instead of just an eager, uncomplicated Labrador retriever?
Right. It's a bit of a weird comparison.
Yeah, exactly. Or, and this is the one that really gets you thinking, why might someone continually choose a harsh, unpredictable lover over someone who is consistently kind?
When you lay all those questions out side by side like that, they create this noticeable friction.
Oh, totally.
Because most of us rarely interrogate our tastes to that degree. We tend to just shrug off our choices by saying, well, we just happen to like what we like.
Like it's just a built-in feature.
Exactly. We treat our tastes as these unquestionable baseline facts about who we are.
We treat our preferences as these fundamental truths. But in today's deep dive, we are going to completely dismantle that assumption.
We really are.
We're looking at this fascinating stack of notes that tracks the evolution of an essay about human preference. And it's an incredible progression to read through.
It's quite a journey.
Yeah. It starts as a really simple outline, expands into some heavy psychological theory, morphs into a few striking poems, and then finally distills into this sharp, slightly uncomfortable reality about why you actually like what you like.
And the overarching mission behind these sources is really what makes them so compelling to me.
Right, because it's not just about food or pets.
No, not at all. The goal here isn't just to analyze flavor profiles or, date selection. The intent is to help you spot the exact, imperceptible moment when your desires stop serving you and you actually start serving them.
Which is a terrifying thought, honestly.
Yeah.
And the core dynamic established right away in the notes is this quiet, almost invisible assumption we all carry around.
Yes.
We assume that because a desire is ours, because it originates inside our own head or our own body, it is somehow authentic and reliable.
We equate the internal origin of a feeling with its objective truth. Like, I feel it, therefore it must be true. But as the text reveals, desire is not inherently trustworthy. It is deeply revealing and it is full of meaning, but it is absolutely not a perfectly calibrated compass pointing to your true north.
So before we can really understand how desires warp and lead us astray, we kind of have to unpack the illusion that our preferences are just random.
Which is a really common belief.
Yeah. I have to admit, I've always thought of preferences as a sort of psychological fingerprint. Just a biological accident of birth?
Sure, like eye color.
Exactly. You have your fingerprint, I have mine, you like vanilla, I prefer strawberry. It's just how we are wired out of the box with no deeper meaning attached.
And, well, it is a comforting way to look at it, and biology undeniably plays a foundational role here.
Okay, so there is some truth to the fingerprint thing.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
The sources note that genetics heavily influence our taste receptors, and importantly, our baseline dopamine sensitivity.
Dopamine again. It always comes back to dopamine.
Always. A person with a naturally underreactive dopamine system might instinctively prefer really intense experiences. So, spicy food, incredibly loud music, or high-risk situations.
Oh, just to feel something.
Right, merely to feel a baseline level of reward that someone else might get from, like, a quiet walk in the park.
Yeah, okay.
But if we stop at the biological fingerprint theory, we completely miss the architecture of what is actually happening. Preferences are heavily constructed over time.
And the text refers to them, rather poetically, I think, as a map of absence.
A map of absence. It's a beautiful phrase.
It really is. Let's unpack that, starting with early attachment, because this directly addresses the harsh lover question from the intro.
Yeah, so the very first relationships we form, usually with our primary caregivers, they basically become the subconscious templates for all our future desires.
The blueprint.
Exactly. If a child grows up in an environment with, say, inconsistent love or chaotic caregivers, they very often grow up to crave a romantic partner who is Unpredictable, emotionally unavailable, or even unkind.
And see, I always hear people say this is because humans secretly enjoy suffering, or, that we are just self-destructive by nature.
Right, the whole self-sabotage narrative.
Yeah, but reading through the notes, it's much more pragmatic than that.
It actually has nothing to do with enjoying pain. It has everything to do with familiarity.
Familiarity.
Yeah. To the human nervous system, familiar patterns are very often misinterpreted as safe patterns.
Oh, wow. So even if the pattern is toxic, it feels safe.
Precisely. You might be drawn to a chaotic partner because your nervous system literally has a map for how to navigate that specific kind of storm.
That makes so much sense.
Right. The preference for chaos isn't just a random personality quirk. It is an unconscious replay of old attachment wounds, seeking an environment where your oldest survival skills are actually useful.
It's a learned survival mechanism disguised as a romantic type. That is wild. And the sources take this further into social signaling, which brings us to the slowy dog.
Ah, yes, the rare Saharan hound.
Yeah. Choosing that incredibly rare, ancient breed over just a friendly, ubiquitous Labrador isn't always just about an affinity for the dog itself.
No. Preferences announce who we desperately wish to be perceived as. Choosing the rare dog signals distinction and sophistication to the outside world.
It's a statement.
Exactly. Or, developing an obsessive preference for some obscure, abrasive noise band that nobody has ever heard of that signals fierce nonconformity.
Right. It's like saying, look how unique I am.
Yes. It is a calculated method of joining what the author calls a tribe of one. The preference functions as a tool for projecting an identity that separates you from the herd.
Which brings us to the deepest driver mentioned in the text, which is compensation for lack. We ultimately desire what we were denied.
That is the core of it.
The child who was granted absolutely no control over their daily life often grows into an adult who demands total, uncompromising autonomy in every single situation.
Or the person who felt utterly invisible at the dinner table as a kid might later develop a profound preference for a partner who obsessively monitors their every move.
Because they finally feel seen.
Exactly. If we pull back and look at the bigger picture, this is the literal definition of desire being a map of absence. It points squarely toward the space that was once empty.
There is a specific line from the source that synthesizes this so beautifully. Desire is not a compass. It is a map drawn after the fact.
That's the one. It's so profound.
So for you listening right now, consider your own strongest, most rigidly non-negotiable preferences. Ask yourself what past absence you might actually be compensating for.
It's a tough question to ask.
It really is. Are you actually chasing a specific flavor or aesthetic, or are you chasing a feeling of control or safety or visibility that you just didn't get enough of years ago?
And once we recognize that our preferences are these historical maps, we can start to observe how we get lost using them today.
Right.
The sources identify 3 specific shifts where a healthy, everyday preference quietly mutates into an unhealthy, rigid requirement.
Okay, so the first major shift involves exclusivity, the degree of the desire.
Yes, the evolution from saying chocolate is my favorite to declaring I will simply do without rather than settle for anything other than chocolate.
And in our culture, refusing to settle is intensely celebrated.
Oh, absolutely. It's seen as a strength.
Yeah. Think about the modern coffee connoisseur who will only drink single origin, pour-over coffee brewed at an exact temperature. We tend to view having impossibly high standards as a virtue, a sign of knowing exactly what you want.
And look, having standards is perfectly healthy. But the critical inflection point is what happens when that exclusivity hardens into an impenetrable wall.
When you literally can't enjoy anything else.
Right. The text argues that this specific mentality is very often perfectionism acting as armor.
Which totally begs the question, armor against what?
Primarily against the fear of making a mistake or the fear of experiencing loss. If you insist on the absolute, unblemished ideal in every situation and refuse to engage with anything less, you never have to wonder if you made the wrong choice.
Wow. You insulate yourself from regret.
Exactly. The sources also highlight that people who grew up with very scarce resources sometimes develop this rigid mentality because, in their past, settling actually led to severe deprivation.
Oh, that makes sense. It's protective.
But in the present, the cost of that armor is that your world physically shrinks. You start leaving experiences unfinished, or you refuse to participate in life at all because the conditions just aren't flawless.
Perfectionism is a defense mechanism against regret. I mean, that changes how I look at my own stubborn habits, honestly.
It's a very common trap.
So another major shift happens with the frequency of the desire. The text uses an analogy here that really stuck with me. They call it chain smoking a preference, and they aren't talking about literal cigarettes.
No, they are talking about the temporal dimension of a desire, like
Mhm.
how rapidly you return to the source of the feeling.
Right.
A casual music fan listens to a favorite song occasionally, letting the enjoyment naturally peak and fade. A person who is chain-smoking that preference will put the exact same song on a loop for 4 hours straight. Right. Or they will constantly seek out the same type of intense romantic conflict. Or they will check their social media feed for a micro-hit of validation every 3 minutes.
It reminds me of using a pacifier. You aren't chain smoking the song or the social media feed because it's bringing you profound joy every single time.
Not at all.
You are usually doing it as an emotional regulation strategy. You're deploying the preference to aggressively mute an unwanted feeling like mounting anxiety or sudden boredom or acute loneliness.
And rituals and repeated preferences are normal. I mean, they anchor the human experience. But the crucial warning sign flagged in the notes is the divergence of time and joy.
Divergence of time and joy, what does that look like in practice?
You have to watch closely for the moment when the amount of time you spend engaging with a desire increases, but the actual enjoyment you extract from it actively shrinks.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you are returning to the well more and more frequently, but you're pulling up less and less water.
Which introduces the breakdown of satiation, the broken off switch. And this is where the notes get into the neuroscience of the brain, which we really need to unpack because it is fundamental to understanding how we get trapped.
It really is. There's a vital structural difference in the human brain between liking something and wanting something.
Wait, aren't those basically the exact same thing?
You'd think so, right? We use those words interchangeably in everyday conversation, but neurologically, they're entirely separate systems.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So liking is actual visceral pleasure. It is the hedonic enjoyment of eating a great meal or feeling a warm breeze.
Okay, so liking is the actual good feeling.
Right. But wanting is driven by a mechanism called incentive salience. It is the raw, driving motivation to pursue a reward, fueled primarily by the mesolimbic dopamine system.
Let me see if I have this right. The dopamine isn't actually giving you the pleasure. The dopamine is giving you the craving. It's the chemical that screams, go get that thing.
Yes, exactly. In a healthy functioning preference, the two systems are synchronized. You want a slice of cake, you pursue it, you eat it, you experience the hedonic pleasure of liking it, and then your brain registers satiation. The craving stops.
The off switch works.
Right. But when that off switch breaks down, usually due to chronic overstimulation, those two neurological systems decouple.
They separate.
Yes. The wanting system skyrockets and becomes hypersensitized, while the liking system, the actual pleasure you feel, just flatlines or builds tolerance.
So you are fiercely compelled to chase a high that your brain is no longer capable of actually feeling.
That's the tragedy of
The craving feels monumental, but the satisfaction is just a ghost. You end up drinking a 7th cup of coffee, and your hands are literally shaking, and it tastes like battery acid, but your brain is still frantically signaling that you need more.
the hunger becomes a structural neurological error rather than a reflection of reality. At that precise moment, you are no longer choosing the pleasure. The pleasure is dictating your actions.
And when these internal mechanisms start to break down, when the exclusivity becomes rigid, the frequency turns into chain smoking, and the satiation switch breaks. Society steps in and assigns heavy, stigmatized labels to the behavior.
Yes, the language changes completely.
The sources move from these subtle internal shifts into extreme behavioral endpoints, using words like hoarding, addiction, and compulsion. And initially, honestly, it felt like a leap. Going from preferring bubblegum ice cream to a clinical diagnosis seems kind of extreme.
It definitely feels extreme until you realize it is the exact same underlying machinery.
Right.
The text frames these extreme endpoints as unopposed gravity. They are not alien diseases that infect a person out of nowhere. They are ordinary, everyday mechanisms of preference that have simply lost their natural governor.
Let's examine hoarding as an example. The text defines hoarding not as an obsession with trash, but as the total collapse of exclusivity and satiation simultaneously.
Well-
And I can actually relate to this on a micro level. I have a drawer in my desk full of old, obsolete charging cables. Cables for phones that haven't existed in a decade.
We all have that drawer.
Seriously. And every time I try to throw them away, I feel this weird, irrational sting of loss, so I just shove them right back in the drawer.
Yeah, you can't let them go.
The notes include a poem that illustrates this so movingly, where the narrator describes keeping 17 identical screwdrivers and holding onto faded ticket stubs from concerts they barely even remember. And the justification is simply that objects don't leave on their own.
And the emotional logic there is profoundly sound when you view it through the lens of unregulated desire. A person hoarding objects cannot choose just one, because choosing one means forsaking the others.
It's that fear of regret again.
Exactly, and they cannot feel the sensation of enough. So the sheer accumulation of mass replaces the experience of enjoyment. The author describes the hoarded space as a museum of frozen desires.
A museum of frozen desires, that is heavy.
The obsolete charging cable in your drawer doesn't matter as a functional object. What matters is that retaining it protects you from the micro-grief of discarding potential.
It's a physical fortress against the concept of loss. The text then moves to addiction and compulsion, describing addiction as preference calcified into a prison. But the description of compulsion is even more jarring, phrasing it as action entirely devoid of desire.
Right. Compulsion forces us to reconsider the whole concept of willpower. A compulsive person does not actually want to perform their ritual, whether it's checking a lock 50 times or washing their hands until they bleed.
They aren't enjoying it.
Not at all. The body's effectively making its own desperate arrangements to relieve an unbearable mounting anxiety, bypassing the person's conscious will completely.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. Refusing to engage in the compulsion doesn't bring relief. It brings a sensation of impending terror. The act itself offers zero pleasure. It only offers a temporary, fleeting silencing of an overwhelming internal pressure.
That reframes so much of human behavior. It also reminds me of the forbidden fruit concept mentioned in the notes. Think about a park where there is a perfectly fine paved path, but one small patch of grass is roped off with a "do not walk" sign.
Oh, I love this example.
Right. Suddenly, walking on that specific patch of grass feels like a magnetic necessity. You don't actually care about the grass, you just want the thrill of crossing the rope.
We constantly mistake the adrenaline of transgression for genuine desire.
Yeah.
The prohibition itself creates the hunger.
Because if you remove the sign and the rope, the grass is just grass, and the desire evaporates instantly.
Exactly. What the person was actually hungry for in that moment was a demonstration of their own autonomy, a physical proof that they cannot be contained.
The sources also tackle idealization, which is clinging desperately to a flawless version of something. You know, the hypothetical dog that never sheds, the imaginary flawless partner who never gets angry.
And idealization guarantees perpetual insatiability, because reality, with all its friction and messiness, can never compete with a flawless phantom in your mind.
You're setting yourself up to fail.
Totally. A person trapped in idealization will cycle through new hobbies or new partners rapidly, dropping them the very second a normal human flaw appears.
Because the flaw ruins the armor.
Yes, it functions as an elaborate defense mechanism against the inevitable grief of loving something real, recognizing it as imperfect, and knowing you might lose it anyway.
If you accept imperfection, loss becomes a survivable part of life. If you demand perfection, loss becomes unthinkable. That is just an exhausting trap. So these extreme endpoints, the hoarding, the compulsion, the idealizing, they aren't moral failings or character flaws.
No, not at all.
They're descriptions of what happens when desire transforms into an atmospheric weather system that you are just trapped inside.
Having mapped out the mechanics and the extremes, we really have to look at the practical application for you, the listener. What is the everyday cost if you simply let your desires drift unchecked? And more importantly, how do you reclaim your agency without completely losing your personality?
That's the big question. Because if unchecked desire is a trap, is the ultimate goal to just become entirely numb? Like, should we all strive to be ascetic monks sitting on a mountain, having absolutely zero preferences about anything? No favorite colors, no favorite foods, no passions.
Right, the instinct is to just shut it all down. But the author explicitly pushes back against that idea, noting that preferences are the color of a life.
I like that.
Yeah. A human life completely devoid of preference would be unrecognizable and stark. The objective is not to violently amputate your desires, but to hold them lightly enough that you retain the ability to put down the spoon when you're full.
So what is the actual cost of just letting your preferences run the show?
A progressively shrinking world. If you leave the broken off switch unchecked, the intensity of your wanting will continually escalate, while your capacity for actual satisfaction degrades.
The decoupled systems again.
Exactly. You end up navigating a life that consists entirely of near misses with the sensation of enough. You acquire the thing you desperately wanted, and instead of joy, you merely feel a temporary relief from the craving.
That is so bleak.
The moment you approach fullness, you instantly feel the anxiety of the next hunger forming. From an external perspective, it might look like you are indulging in everything, but from the inside, it feels like perpetual, quiet deprivation.
So how do we start to repair that broken switch? The notes outline a practice called microflexibility, and I think it is a brilliant intervention. It's like taking your preferences to the gym.
That's a great way to put it. Microflexibility is the deliberate antidote to rigidity. The practice involves intentionally choosing your second best option once a week, just to prove to your own nervous system that you will actually survive the experience.
So you desperately want your usual corner table by the window at the cafe, but you intentionally choose to sit at the loud table in the middle of the room, and the world doesn't collapse.
Exactly. You realize that your capacity to exist is larger than your specific environmental requirements.
It actively builds psychological resilience. The sources pair this with the practice of savoring, which directly targets the neurological decoupling of wanting and liking.
Right, the 30-second pause.
The 30-second pause, tell us about that.
So, before you take the next bite of a meal, before you click purchase on an item, before you swipe to the next short-form video on your phone, you force a hard 30-second pause.
Which feels like an eternity in the moment.
Oh, it really does.
Yeah.
But during that pause, you name 3 specific sensory details of your present environment. It is essentially using grounded gratitude as satiation training, forcing the brain to register the present moment rather than leaning entirely into the anticipation of the next hit.
And part of that is recognizing the lie inherent in the phrase, just one more. The text points out that the phrase, just one more, is the literal, audible sound of insatiability talking.
It is never just one more.
Never. The hunger is bottomless by design.
Which leads us to the core diagnostic question you must ask yourself when a sudden craving hits you with overwhelming force. When the desire feels absolute, you have to stop and ask, what would I actually need right now if this specific thing suddenly disappeared from the earth?
So if the coffee ceased to exist, if the social media feed vanished, if the option to send that risky late-night text message was gone, what do I fundamentally need?
The answer is almost always incredibly simple and much quieter than the screaming craving.
Yeah.
You need physical rest.
Yeah.
You need reassuring human touch. You need uninterrupted silence. Or you need a basic sense of purpose. You cannot build a stable life on the shifting sands of wanting. You can only build a life on what remains when the wanting finally settles.
You can only build a life on what remains. To trace the path of our deep dive today, we started by recognizing that our everyday tastes are not random biological accidents, but rather complex maps pointing toward past absences and early survival mechanisms. We examined how entirely healthy desires can warp through exclusivity, frequency, and a decoupled neurological satiation switch, trapping us in perfectionism or compulsion. And we explored how the way out isn't to kill our preferences, but to gently untangle them through micro-flexibility and a willingness to sit with our actual underlying needs.
And as we wrap up, I want you to think about the tiny, almost imperceptible moment when your hand automatically reaches for something. Your phone, a specific snack, or even a specific person.
We do it 100 times a day.
In that fraction of a second, you aren't reaching because you're genuinely hungry or because you are actually in need of connection. You are reaching simply because your hand remembers reaching.
Wow.
It is pure muscle memory, a groove worn deep into your nervous system over thousands of repetitions. And most of us live entirely inside that muscle memory for years, calling it our personality, or even mistaking it for love.
So true.
The provocation for you as you move through your day is this. The next time your hand automatically reaches to satisfy your deepest, most ingrained preference, what would happen if you just stopped mid-reach, left your hand suspended in the air, and allowed yourself to feel whatever vast, uncomfortable emptiness or quiet truth is waiting underneath?